Blameless doesn't mean what you think it means, and it never once meant never sinned. Most of us picture a courtroom, a clean verdict, a record with nothing left to prosecute, a lifetime with no marks against it. The kind of life where nobody can stand up and point a finger. That's the definition sitting in your head right now, and it's the one I carried around for years too. Open your Bible and watch it fall apart. Noah gets called this. Abraham gets called this decades before he does anything to earn it. Job gets called this too, right in the book's very first verse, despite spending half his story insisting he doesn't understand why disaster ever found him. Now follow the same word somewhere stranger. A sheep pen. Before a lamb was allowed anywhere near an altar, somebody walked it over and looked it up and down for anything broken or wrong. Whatever passed that inspection got called by the identical Hebrew word stamped on Noah, on Abraham, and on Job. A patriarch and a lamb, carrying the same word on the same pages of the same book. That's strange enough to be worth chasing down. Over the next half hour, we're going to trace this one word everywhere it shows up, through a covenant sign cut into an old man's body, and a funeral lament that ends up sounding like something bigger than the man it was written for. Your English Bible hides this from you. Not on purpose, maybe, but the effect is the same. Pick up an ESV, and you'll find that single Hebrew word translated 3 separate ways depending on what's wearing it. Blameless for a person, without blemish for an animal, perfect for God's own character. 3 different English words doing the work of one Hebrew word, split apart so cleanly you'd never suspect they were the same term to begin with. That word is Tamim. What it's actually asking has almost nothing to do with your permanent record. We'll get into exactly what it measures and where it comes from in just a moment. For now, sit with this. Tamim was never a moral scorecard. It's the difference between a heart split into 2 loyalties and a heart that's whole, all in one piece, with nothing held back. That's a very different question than the one most of us have spent our lives answering. Have I done enough wrong to disqualify myself belongs to a scorecard. Am I whole or am I divided belongs to something else entirely. It's the question this word was actually built to ask, long before anyone thought to turn faith into a tally sheet. Tamim shows up next in stranger places still. A circumcision knife, a lamb living inside somebody's house for 4 days, a father waking before sunrise to pray over sins his grown children might not have even committed. Once you see all of that, blameless stops sounding like a verdict. It starts sounding like something else entirely. That word has a home base, and it's worth pausing there before we go anywhere else. Tamim, Strong's number H8549, comes from a Hebrew root tamam that simply means to finish or to be complete. Nothing about wrongdoing hides inside that root. Nothing about a courtroom, a verdict, or a permanent record. The base idea is closer to a circle drawn all the way around. No gap left open, nothing missing from the shape. That's why an Old Testament sacrifice got checked over so carefully before it was ever offered. Wholeness, in this sense, isn't about innocence. It's about integrity in the oldest sense of that word. Every part present and sound, nothing broken off or held back. English doesn't really have a single word that does this job. Blameless leans legal. Perfect leans flawless. Tamim just means the thing is intact all the way through, with nothing missing and nothing hidden. There's a shorter cousin of this word too, spelled tam, built from the very same root family. You'll meet it properly a little later, attached to a man who spent his mornings doing something most of us would never think to do. For now, just tuck the name away. Same root, same core idea of wholeness, a slightly different shape of the word, showing up in a very different kind of story. Which brings us to a hillside in Genesis chapter 17. Abram, already old, still waiting on a promise that hasn't arrived, face down in the dirt. God appears and says something startling. Walk before me and be Tamim. Then comes a new name, Abraham, and a covenant sign that has nothing to do with words at all. Circumcision. On that exact day, according to the text, every male in Abraham's household went through it. Not just the infants born into the family, but grown men, servants, anyone under his roof. We know from earlier in Genesis that Abraham's household was large enough to arm 318 men born in his own house. Hundreds of men, in other words, all within days of each other. Even allowing for years of change by this point, that meant grown men undergoing the same procedure within hours of each other, with a blade and nothing to numb the pain. Genesis doesn't linger on the physical cost here, but a later chapter shows exactly how steep that cost really was. In Genesis chapter 34, Jacob's sons used the days right after this procedure as a tactical window. The text is specific about it. On the third day, when the men were still sore, that's exactly when they strike. That's not a detail from a softened Sunday school version. That's the actual physical toll sitting underneath one word, Tamim. And here's what's easy to miss about the timing. This wasn't a reward handed to Abraham for a spotless record already earned. By this point in his story, he'd already lied about his own wife once, letting another man nearly take her rather than risk his own safety. He'd do the same thing again years later with a different king, long after this very promise was already in motion. God doesn't call him Tamim after he's earned a clean file. God calls him into Tamim, summons him toward it, on the very day he receives a new name and a new identity. So the covenant sign wasn't a certificate for good behavior already completed. It was physical, painful, and permanent, cut into the body of every man in that household on a single afternoon. It marked the start of a wholehearted yes, not the finish line after one. There was no undoing it once it was done, and no way to change his mind the following week. Picture that household a few days later. Men who could barely walk, from the youngest servant to the 99-year-old patriarch himself, all carrying the same fresh wound. Nobody under that roof could pretend they hadn't chosen this. The cost made sure of that, and so did the scale of it. This wasn't one private decision made behind closed doors, but an entire household changed on the same afternoon. That's the first place Tamim actually lives in this text. Not attached to a test already passed, but to a relationship somebody was stepping into at real physical cost with nothing held back. It's a strange place to start a word study about wholeness, a knife before a promise. But that's exactly the order this story insists on. Think of a potter running a hand along the inside of a clay jar. She's feeling for the one hairline crack that would let everything inside leak out. Not asking what that jar has done, just testing whether it holds together all the way through, right now. That's close to the test a family in Goshen ran on something very different, a live lamb, 4 days before the worst night in Egypt's history. Exodus chapter 12 lays out the instructions plainly. On the 10th day of the month, each household picks a lamb, a year old, without defect, one per family. A household too small to finish a whole animal shares with the nearest neighbor, counting heads carefully so nothing goes to waste and nothing spoils overnight. Then comes the strange part. The lamb doesn't go straight to slaughter, it moves in. For 4 full days, it lives inside the house, penned somewhere close, while the family goes about ordinary life around it. Picture what that actually meant. A live animal kept in a small mud brick house filled that single room with its smell morning and evening, while children stepped around it on their way to sleep. Someone checked it up close, day after day, not with a glance from across a courtyard. A child might have given it a name by the second day. That's the kind of household this was. Intimate enough to get attached, practical enough to still slaughter it on schedule 4 days later. What does it take for something to stay whole under that kind of scrutiny? Not a single look at an altar. 4 days of proximity with nowhere to hide a limp or a clouded eye, and no way to fake soundness once children were close enough to touch it. On the 14th day, at twilight, the household slaughtered the lamb. They roasted it whole that same night, head, legs, and inner parts together, the text specifies. Whatever wasn't eaten by dawn had to be burned before sunrise, leaving no leftovers, no lingering evidence of the meal at all. That's Tamim tested by nearness, not by a snapshot. A limp or a clouded eye might survive one glance from a priest across a courtyard. It would not survive 4 days of children walking past it, hands resting on its back, a whole family watching it eat and sleep in the middle of their own home. Wholeness that only holds up under a quick inspection isn't much of a claim. Wholeness that survives 4 days of proximity under a child's curious hands is a different thing altogether. And it's the same word, Tamim, doing both jobs. Now carry that word into a very different household, one with far more at stake and far less scrutiny involved. Nobody was checking anything at all. You met Tom last chapter, tucked away as Tamim's shorter cousin, built from the same root. Here's where it actually lives, the opening verse of the book of Job, describing a man whose wealth put him near the top of anyone's list in the ancient Near East. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels. A herd that size needed dozens of hired hands just to water it and move it season after season. And every morning, before any of that work even started, Job got up in the dark and offered a burnt offering. Not once, as a single gesture, he did this every time his sons finished a full cycle of feasting together, rising early according to the number of them all. Covering sins his own grown children might have committed at their table, sins he couldn't confirm had happened and couldn't undo if they had. Nobody told him to do this. Nothing in the text suggests his children were doing anything wrong. He simply kept covering the possibility, year after year, long before anyone accused him of anything. That's not one righteous decision made once and remembered. That's a routine, repeated for years, aimed at faults Job never even got to see. Then, in a single day, messenger after messenger arrives, each with worse news than the one before. Servants and livestock lost to raiders and fire. And finally his 10 children, killed when the house they were feasting in collapsed around them. Job's response gets recorded in 4 short verses. He got up and tore his robe, then shaved his head. He fell to the ground and worshipped there. He said that he'd come into the world with nothing and would leave it the same way, that the Lord had given and the Lord had taken away, and blessed be the name of the Lord. The text adds one more line, easy to miss on a first read. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. That's the same word, Tom, sitting right beside a debt that size. Not the absence of grief. Job tears his robe and shaves his head, the standard signs of mourning in that world, not a stoic's silence. Not even the absence of confusion, since Job spends most of the book that follows demanding an explanation he never fully gets. What Tom describes here is narrower than either of those. It's a man whose orientation toward God didn't buckle the moment everything else did. Tamim held up under 4 days of proximity, checked by hands that had every chance to find a flaw. Tom held up under the worst mourning of a man's life, tested by a loss no careful living could have prepared him for. Neither one was ever about a spotless record kept somewhere for later review. Both were about what's left standing when everything gets tested at close range. The question this word keeps circling back to, book after book. That question doesn't stop with a lamb pen or a grieving father either. It follows this word all the way to a king's song written decades later by a man whose own life puts Tamim through a harder test than either of these two ever did. David was old by the time he wrote this song. Not young and rising, the shepherd boy who once faced down a giant. This was a battle-scarred king near the end of a long, complicated life, looking back over decades of war and looking for words big enough to hold what he'd survived. 2 Samuel chapter 22 records that song in full. Somewhere past the halfway point, David says something bold about himself. He calls himself Tamim before the Lord. A few verses later, he uses the identical word again, this time for God. This God, his way is Tamim. That's a strange claim coming from David specifically. By this point in his story, he'd taken another man's wife and arranged for that man's death to cover it up. Any honest reading of his biography rules out flawless as the meaning here. Whatever David means by Tamim, it isn't a clean record. It can't be. Here's what makes this song even stranger. It survives twice in Scripture, almost word for word, once here in Samuel, and again as Psalm 18. That's one of the only long pieces of Hebrew poetry the Bible bothered to preserve in 2 separate places. The heading on that psalm says it was written, "To the choir master." That's not a private journal entry tucked away where nobody could read it. That's a piece of music, arranged for public performance, rehearsed, sung out loud, generation after generation, by people who knew exactly what David's life actually contained. Think about that for a second. A congregation singing a king's claim to Tamim out loud together, knowing that same king had broken most of the commandments in one stretch of a single year. Nobody pulled the song from the songbook afterward, and nobody scrubbed the word out once the scandal became public knowledge. The claim stayed in the liturgy, sung by people who had every reason to know better. Tamim here can't mean a scorecard with nothing on it. It has to mean something closer to a present tense orientation, holding nothing back now, whatever came before. Undivided loyalty, not an unbroken record. And that's exactly flexible enough to also describe God's way 3 verses later, without contradiction. Because God's Tamim and David's Tamim aren't claiming the same kind of perfection. One describes a flawless nature. The other describes a heart finally facing the right direction. Which brings the word somewhere much stranger still. Not a battlefield this time, but a funeral song for a king who may not have been entirely human. Ezekiel chapter 28 opens as a lament over the king of Tyre, a wealthy trading city on the coast, rich enough that its ruler had started believing his own press. A few verses in, the language stops fitting any ordinary monarch. This king was in Eden, the garden of God, covered in precious stones, sardius, topaz, and diamond. The text lists them out like an inventory. He was an anointed guardian cherub set on the holy mountain of God, walking among what the passage calls stones of fire. And in verse 15, God says this about him: He was Tamim in his ways from the day he was created, until unrighteousness was found in him. That's the only place in the entire Bible where Tamim describes someone at the exact moment they were made. Not a lifetime performance record, not a test passed after years of proving. A starting condition, present from day one, that later broke. And the verses right after describe exactly how. The heart lifted up because of beauty. Wisdom corrupted for the sake of splendor. Trade and violence filling him from the inside, until God casts him down from that mountain as profaned, driven out from among the stones of fire that once surrounded him. Whatever Tamim looked like on day one, it didn't survive contact with pride. Careful readers disagree about who this passage is really describing. Some read it as poetic language for a proud, doomed human king, dressed up in the most extravagant imagery the prophet could reach for. Tyre's own king and no one else. Others read it as something reaching further, toward the corruption of a heavenly being, long before humanity even existed. Honestly, both readings have serious scholars behind them, and I'm not pretending this one is settled. But either way, verse 15 gives us the starkest example in this whole word study. Tamim here isn't a guarantee against failure. It's a condition that existed, intact, and then didn't. Something present at creation, described in the clearest terms the language has for wholeness, and still capable of being lost. Put David and this verse side by side, and the shape of the word gets sharper. Tamim was never a claim that failure is impossible. Not for a king with blood on his hands, sung about in public for centuries afterward. And not, it turns out, for a being present at the dawn of creation itself, standing closer to God than anything else in the passage. It's a condition, whole, undivided, nothing held back, and conditions can change. That's the vessel from the start of this chapter, in other words. Not shattered all at once, but cracked from the inside, slowly enough that the crack might not even show at first. David's version of the crack came from choices made in plain sight, over months, right in front of everyone. The cherub's version came from somewhere less visible. Beauty curdling into pride, wisdom bent by its own splendor, until one day it wasn't wholeness anymore, and nobody could point to the exact moment it stopped. Two very different timelines, the same word breaking in both directions. Which leaves one honest question hanging over everything this video has covered so far, from a knife in Genesis to a fallen cherub in Ezekiel. If Tamim can be lost this completely, in a garden, before human history even starts, is there any way for it to come back? There's an answer to that question. It's been sitting in plain sight since Exodus chapter 12, waiting for one more piece of evidence to click into place. That evidence comes from a translation choice made centuries before Christ was born, long before anyone in Rome had ever heard the name Jesus of Nazareth. Around the 3rd century BC, Jewish scholars in Egypt translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. The result is now called the Septuagint, the version most people in the 1st century Mediterranean world actually read, since Greek had become the common language from Rome to the edges of Persia. When those translators reached the lamb regulations in Exodus, the word Tamim needed a Greek equivalent. They chose Amōmos, Strong's number G299. It means without blemish, built from a root for stain or spot, with a prefix that negates it. When those same translators reached Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 15, the verse about the fallen guardian cherub, they reached for the identical word again. That's not a connection any New Testament writer invented later out of nowhere. It was already baked into the Greek Bible that every literate person in the 1st century read and quoted from. Amōmos was simply what Tamim had become in the common language of the whole Mediterranean world, generations before Jesus ever preached a sermon. Which means something specific about a line in Peter's first letter. Writing to scattered, frightened churches, Peter calls Jesus a lamb without blemish or spot. He isn't reaching for a fresh metaphor. He's using Amōmos, the exact vocabulary of that family in Goshen checking a lamb for 4 days before the worst night in Egypt's history, unable to hide a single flaw from a child's curious hands. Paul does the same thing twice in 2 different letters to 2 different cities. Ephesians says believers were chosen before the foundation of the world to be holy and Amōmos. Colossians says Christ's death is meant to present you holy and Amōmos before God, standing exactly where the crack used to be. And Hebrews, describing what happened on the cross, says Christ offered himself Amōmos through the eternal Spirit to cleanse the conscience itself. Same word, now aimed at the inside of a person instead of the outside of an animal. None of those 4 writers coordinated with each other. They wrote separate letters to separate churches scattered across the empire. And every one of them reached for the same Greek word, sitting right on top of the same Hebrew word this whole video has been tracing. Now the arc of this whole word study closes. It's worth watching it close all at once. A wholeness existed once in a garden, in a being who walked among stones of fire, standing closer to God than anything else in that lament. Pride cracked it from the inside, gradually enough that Ezekiel has to describe the exact moment it happened, because nobody watching could have pointed to it as it occurred. That same wholeness got demanded, generation after generation, in an actual lamb, checked not by a glance from across a courtyard, but by 4 days of children walking past it and growing attached before it was ever slaughtered. It cost Abraham's whole household a knife and a fresh wound in a single afternoon. Every man under his roof, on the same day he received a new name. It held Job upright through the single worst morning of his life, the one that took nearly everything he owned, even his children. And it let David call himself whole in a public song, sung by choirs for generations, decades after doing the worst things he ever did. Because Tamim was never about the record. It was about which direction his heart was actually facing now. According to 4 separate New Testament writers, all of that gets answered by one specific Amōmos lamb, offered once, on behalf of people who could never have passed the 4-day test themselves. Remember the potter from chapter 3, running a hand along the inside of a jar, feeling for the one crack that would let everything leak out? A cracked vessel doesn't mend itself by trying harder to hold water. Someone has to either seal the crack from the outside or hand over a whole vessel to replace the broken one entirely. What Peter and Paul and the writer of Hebrews are all claiming, using the same Greek word 4 separate times, is that God supplied the second kind. Not a patch job or a longer inspection process going forward. An actual whole vessel, offered in place of the cracked one, so the crack stops being the thing that defines you. That's the whole shape of Tamim. Not a scorecard, but a condition, one that could be lost completely, and one that, it turns out, could also be given back. Not earned back through decades of better behavior, given freely through a lamb standing in for people who never could have earned the word themselves. Which is exactly where this needs to land next, for anyone still carrying their own hairline crack around like it's the last word on who they are. Somewhere watching this, there's a specific person carrying a specific chapter around like a life sentence. Maybe it's a divorce they caused decades ago now. It still stings every time a grandchild asks why Grandpa and that first wife never speak. And there's no good answer that fits in a sentence. Maybe it's a business decision that hurts someone who trusted them, a partner who lost everything on their advice and never got so much as an apology, because apologizing would have meant admitting it out loud. Maybe it's a sibling they haven't spoken to in 20 years, something that felt enormous at the time and now barely makes sense, except the silence itself has become its own kind of proof. Whatever the chapter is, this person has done a private accounting. Late at night, maybe, or in the car on the way home from church, running the numbers one more time. And they've decided it disqualifies them. Not from salvation, necessarily, from something closer to home, from ever being the kind of person their own kids should look up to. So they downplay their faith at the dinner table, letting their grown children assume it never mattered much to them. They turn down chances to mentor, or to speak at a grandchild's baptism. Some version of, who am I to teach anybody anything, after decades of showing up, decades of getting most of it right without much applause. And one chapter from years ago still runs the whole account in their head, overruling everything that came after it. Here's what this word actually says to that account. Tamim was never a lifetime batting average. Every case study in this video has already made that case. Think about the patriarch who'd already lied about his own wife once and would do it again years later, summoned into wholeness anyway on the very day he got a new name. Or the grieving father, unsure whether his own children had sinned behind his back, covering the possibility every morning without ever demanding proof. Even the king with blood on his hands got the word. He sang his claim to wholeness out loud, decades later, to a congregation that knew exactly what he'd done. None of them qualified on a clean record, and all of them got called Tamim anyway. Even the guardian cherub back in Ezekiel, standing closer to God than anyone else in this video, lost the word entirely once pride got into it. which means Tamim was never a permanent grade, handed out once and locked in either direction. The word was never asking what happened in the past. It was asking which direction the heart is facing right now, today, in this room. And for anyone who still doesn't trust that answer about themselves, there's the lamb. Not a lamb that had to prove itself worthy over decades of good behavior, the way this person has been privately trying to prove it for years. One lamb offered once, doing on someone else's behalf what 4 days of scrutiny never could have accomplished on its own. That's not a footnote tucked into the fine print of a sermon. That's the entire claim of Ephesians and Colossians and Hebrews, stated in the plainest terms 4 different writers could find. The wholeness gets supplied, not earned back at all. The clay vessel from earlier in this video was never being asked to produce a spotless history. It was only ever being asked one question: does it hold together all the way through right now? And for the person still carrying one chapter like a verdict, the honest answer this word offers is permission to finally set that verdict down. Set it down the way you'd finally set down something heavy, something you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten your hands were ever full. If someone in your life has been carrying one chapter of their own story like it cancels out everything else, this might be worth sending their way. Maybe a parent who stopped talking about their own faith around their grown kids because of a decision decades ago they've never quite forgiven themselves for. Maybe it's the person watching this right now, because that's what Tamim was actually saying all along, underneath every strange place it turned up. Not a moral scorecard. The difference between a heart split into 2 loyalties and a heart that's whole, all in one piece, with nothing held back.